The Allied forces arrived as heroes, promising justice, peace, and an end to suffering. But behind those noble words came something darker. The lives of countless women were destroyed by the very soldiers they thought would save them. Entire families vanished overnight, and the ones who survived lived with wounds no one wanted to see. It began in France, just as the war was nearing its end. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, thousands of soldiers poured into French towns and villages. People lined the streets, waving flags, crying with relief, and showering soldiers with flowers and wine. For many, it felt like the nightmare was ending. But beneath that joy, something else began to happen. As towns were liberated one by one, old grudges and suspicions came boiling to the surface. Some French women had formed relationships with German soldiers during the occupation. They became easy targets for revenge. Crowds turned against them, dragging them into public squares. Their heads were shaved, sometimes burned with cigarettes, and they were forced to march half-naked through the streets while people jeered. In places like Chartres and Marseille, hundreds of women faced the same humiliation in front of cheering mobs. Most of these punishments weren't ordered by the military, but carried out by French civilians and local resistance fighters who wanted to cleanse the country of anything tied to Germany. Yet many Allied soldiers stood by watching. Some even took photos, treating it as part of the victory celebrations. The soldiers were hailed as heroes, and few questioned what was happening in the chaos. The line between justice and cruelty disappeared. At the same time, reports started to spread about U.S. troops committing crimes of their own. Many soldiers were far from home, exhausted, and living through months of violent combat. But war does not excuse what followed. Between June 1944 and May 1945, historians estimate that about 4,500 French women were raped by American servicemen. The U.S. Army did hold some trials in which 904 soldiers were officially charged, but that number was small compared to how many attacks actually took place. Most victims stayed silent out of fear of shame, knowing that speaking up would bring more pain than justice. In Normandy, especially in the Manche region, the violence was severe. Local records show over 200 rapes and 30 murders committed by U.S. troops. Many of these incidents happened in small farming villages where women were alone, while men were at the front or in prison camps. In the port city of Le Havre, civilians wrote letters to local authorities describing soldiers forcing their way into homes, stealing from families, and attacking women at night. For those who had dreamed of liberation, this was not at all what they imagined. Similarly, by the beginning of 1945, Germany was collapsing from all sides. Cities lay in ruins, food was running out, and millions of civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, waited in fear for the armies marching toward them. From the east came the Soviet Red Army, driven by rage after years of Nazi invasion and unimaginable suffering on their own soil. From the west came the American, British, and Canadian forces, determined to end the war. But for many German women, the arrival of both sides brought not relief, but horror. When Soviet troops poured into East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, they carried not only victory, but vengeance. The memory of what German soldiers had done in the Soviet Union, burned villages, murdered civilians, and raped women, was fresh in their minds. For many Red Army soldiers, every German woman became a symbol of that pain, and revenge became justification. Historians estimate that between 1.4 and 2 million women in those regions were raped during the Soviet advance. The violence was brutal, and many women were attacked over and over again, sometimes by entire groups of soldiers. In some cases, a single woman was raped dozens of times in one night. The city of Berlin became the center of this nightmare. When Soviet troops entered the capital in April 1945, chaos filled the streets. Families hid in basements, hospitals overflowed, and soldiers went door to door searching for valuables, food, and women. Doctors later reported that some victims were as young as 8 years old, and others were elderly women in their 70s and 80s. Many were left severely injured, and some took their own lives afterward, unable to bear the trauma. At least 10,000 women are believed to have died from the violence, infections, or suicide. Across the country, total female deaths linked to these assaults may have reached 240,000. The Soviet command knew these crimes were happening. Reports from the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, show that at least 4,000 officers were officially punished for offenses against civilians. But in truth, this was only a fraction compared to the scale of what occurred. Most soldiers were never charged. Commanders often looked the other way, seeing the violence as a natural result of victory. In some units, drunkenness and lack of control made things even worse. Entire villages were left devastated not by battle, but what happened after the fighting stopped. Western Allied troops, though less violent on a mass scale, also committed serious crimes. In April 1945, soldiers from the U.S. 12th Armored Division entered the German village of Liebach. There they killed 36 captured German soldiers and raped around 20 local women. This event, known as the Liebach Massacre, became one of the few documented cases of U.S. war crimes in Germany. But it wasn't the only one. As the Americans and British moved deeper into the country, reports of rape, looting, and intimidation appeared in many towns. Some victims tried to report the assaults, but most investigations went nowhere. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the suffering of its women had reached unimaginable levels. They had survived bombings, hunger, and the collapse of their country, only to be attacked by those who claimed to bring peace. But the nightmare didn't stop at Germany's borders. As the Red Army continued its push westward through Eastern Europe, the battles did not just destroy armies, they tore through civilian life. In late 1944 and early 1945, the Soviet troops entered the Balkans, moving through Romania, Bulgaria, and into Serbia. Their goal was to drive out the German occupiers and help the Yugoslav partisans, who were fighting under Josip Broz Tito. But as the front lines shifted and German forces retreated, the chaos of war gave way to something far darker. Alongside liberation came fear, and behind victory came suffering that left deep scars across the region. In Serbia, the violence quickly spread as discipline among soldiers broke down. The Soviets were hailed as heroes when they first entered towns like Beograd, Novi Sad, and Niš. But celebrations soon turned into terror for many women. Official records from the time reveal that over 5,000 women and girls had been assaulted by soldiers moving through the area. In Beograd alone, more than 2,000 cases were documented before the year ended, and many more went unreported out of fear or shame. These attacks often happened in places where control changed hands frequently. One day, German troops occupied a village. The next day, it was the Soviets or the partisans. With no stable government or functioning police, there was almost no law. Women were left unprotected and vulnerable. Many were dragged from their homes, assaulted in public streets, or attacked while seeking shelter. Families who had survived the bombings now faced new horrors inside their own doorways. The suffering wasn't limited to Serbia. Across Eastern Europe, the same pattern unfolded. In Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and parts of Romania, local women faced widespread sexual violence as the Red Army advanced. Although exact numbers are hard to confirm, Historians agree that it was a massive continent-wide tragedy. In Budapest alone, Hungarian archives suggest tens of thousands of women were assaulted during the Soviet siege of the city. In Poland, survivors spoke of soldiers breaking into homes, hospitals, and even convents. While Eastern Europe was drowning in fear and vengeance, another story was unfolding to the south, in Italy. When the Allies landed in Italy in 1943, it was seen as the beginning of the end for Mussolini's fascist regime. The invasion started in Sicily in July, led by British and American forces under General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. From there, the campaign moved to the mainland. Town by town, the Allies pushed through Naples, Anzio, and eventually to Rome. But while the military goal was liberation, the reality for many civilians, especially women, was far from peaceful. Italy was deeply divided at the time. The South had fallen under Allied control, but the North was still loyal to Mussolini and occupied by the Germans. This split caused enormous confusion, and accusations of collaboration became common. Women who were believed to have been friendly with German soldiers or local fascists faced brutal revenge. In some villages, they were attacked by resistance fighters who believed they were helping the enemy. Allied soldiers, though not always directly involved, often witnessed these acts and did little to stop them. After Rome was captured on June 4, 1944, celebrations filled the city. But in the shadows, women accused of betrayal suffered cruel punishment. Some were dragged from their homes and humiliated in front of neighbors. Others were handed over to local militias for questioning, which sometimes meant torture or death. Many of these events went unrecorded, and shame and chaos made it difficult to track what really happened. Still, survivors later recalled how fear replaced the joy of freedom. In southern Italy, where Allied forces had been stationed since 1943, the situation was also complex. The collapse of Mussolini's rule left law and order in ruins. Allied troops came into daily contact with civilians. While most behaved respectfully, a small but damaging number committed crimes against local women. Reports of assaults surfaced in towns near Naples, Salerno, and along the Liri Valley. One of the most disturbing episodes came from the so-called Moroccanate, referring to the mass rapes carried out by Moroccan colonial troops serving under the French Expeditionary Corps. These units, known as Goumiers, were used during the Battle of Monte Cassino in May 1944. After breaking through the German lines, they were allowed to move freely across villages in the Chioggia region. Over the next days, thousands of Italian women and even men were raped and brutalized. Historians believe around 7,000 women were assaulted, and hundreds were killed. Many of the victims were from small mountain villages where no one could protect them. Despite the scale of these crimes, very few were punished. Some commanders dismissed the reports as exaggerations, while others quietly issued compensation to victims. The Italian government later recognized these women as victims of war, but justice was limited and slow. Many survivors lived with trauma and silence for decades, too ashamed to speak of what had been done to them. By now, the image of the heroic liberator had started to blur. Even among the Allied forces, cracks began to show. Within the Allied ranks, there were men who crossed moral lines and committed crimes that were covered up or forgotten. British troops, for example, were involved in several incidents that went against both military law and the spirit of liberation. In France, after the D-Day landings, towns like Bayeux and Caen saw episodes of looting and misconduct. Some British soldiers broke into homes and shops, stealing valuables or taking whatever they could find. This kind of behavior violated the Hague Conventions, which strictly banned the theft or mistreatment of civilians in occupied areas. But with war chaos, discipline often broke down. There were also reports of British soldiers assaulting women in areas they were meant to protect, Although fewer in number compared to the crimes committed by Soviet forces, these cases did happen. Because of strict military censorship, most of them never reached the public. In the same regions, some British troops executed captured German prisoners out of anger or revenge. The fighting in Normandy and northern France had been brutal, and emotions ran high. But executing unarmed prisoners was a war crime under international law. In many cases, these incidents were not officially reported, or were later justified as battlefield confusion. Historians have since found evidence of small-scale massacres that suggest the line between justice and vengeance was often blurred. Canadian forces, too, had moments of failure. Canadian military records mention isolated cases of sexual assault during the liberation of France and the Netherlands. Other Allied nations, including Australian, New Zealand, and Free French troops, faced similar accusations. The chaos of war, the long months of combat, and the lack of strict control created conditions where abuse could occur. And when the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world began to breathe again. Cities were in ruins. Millions were dead, and nations had to rebuild from nothing. People wanted to move forward, to celebrate victory and peace after 6 long years of horror. But for countless women who had been raped, beaten, or humiliated during the war, peace brought no relief. In Germany, France, Poland, Serbia, and across Eastern Europe, women who had suffered sexual violence were left to face their trauma alone. Many could not talk about what had happened. Society viewed them not as victims, but as tainted. The shame was crushing. Some women became pregnant from the assaults and were forced to give birth to children fathered by enemy soldiers. Others contracted diseases in a time when medical care was almost impossible to get. Many were cast out by their families, or their marriages broke apart because of what they endured. In Germany, the number of reported rapes was far lower than what historians now believe actually took place. In some areas, barely any cases were officially recorded, even though whole towns had been affected. Talking about rape was considered deeply shameful in German culture at the time, and many women stayed silent to protect their dignity or avoid being blamed. Some survivors never told their husbands or children what had happened. Those who did speak risked being ignored, insulted, or even punished for dishonoring their families. In Eastern Europe, the silence was even deeper. The Soviet Union had emerged as one of the victors of the war, and its image as a liberator was carefully protected by propaganda. Discussing Soviet crimes was forbidden. Women in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and the Balkans who had suffered at the hands of the Red Army soldiers could not speak at all. If they tried, they were silenced or accused of spreading lies against the state. The new communist governments only focused on Nazi atrocities and completely ignored or denied the suffering caused by their own troops. Even in Western Europe, Allied crimes were often swept under the rug. Many victims had no idea they could even report such crimes. The government wanted to protect the image of the liberating armies, and the last thing they wanted was for stories of misconduct to tarnish their victory. In the years after the war, most women who had been assaulted carried their trauma silently for the rest of their lives. There were no counseling services, no recognition, and no justice. Many took their stories to their graves. The few who did speak up often faced disbelief or were told to move on. It was easier for nations to celebrate heroes than to confront uncomfortable truths. It took decades before historians began to uncover this hidden history. For a long time, archives were sealed or censored, and documents that mentioned sexual violence were destroyed. But from the late 20th century onward, a new generation of researchers, like Antony Beevor, J. Robert Lilly, Alice Kaplan, Miriam Gebhardt, and others began piecing together the evidence. Their work showed that wartime rape was not just the work of a few bad men, but a widespread and devastating part of the conflict. Organizations like Medica Mondiale later helped bring attention to these forgotten victims, collecting testimonies from survivors who had lived in silence for more than half a century. In France, historians found testimonies of young women who had relationships with German soldiers, not out of loyalty, but out of survival. During the occupation, food was scarce, and many women were trying to feed their children or sick parents. Some worked as cleaners or cooks for the German forces. Others accepted relationships, simply to avoid starvation. But when liberation came, the same people who had once turned a blind eye now sought revenge. Women of every background were attacked. Age offered no protection. For the women who lived through these horrors, the damage went far beyond the physical wounds. Many suffered deep psychological scars that never healed. Depression, trauma, nightmares, and constant fear became part of their lives. Some could no longer trust anyone, while others isolated themselves completely. A few tried to bury their memories, but the pain always found a way back. Children born from the assaults, often called war children, faced their own silent battles. They grew up not knowing who their fathers were, or being told lies about their origins. In Germany and France, these children often faced bullying or were sent to orphanages. In Eastern Europe, many were hidden from the public because their fathers were Soviet soldiers, and admitting that was politically dangerous. These children carried the pain of their mothers and the guilt of circumstances they could never control. Today, recognition is slowly growing. In Germany, a few towns have placed small memorials honoring women who were raped in 1945. In France, museums and exhibitions have documented the humiliation of the shorn woman. In Serbia and other parts of Eastern Europe, historians continue to uncover hidden testimonies from local archives. Yet despite this progress, official apologies are still rare. Some governments prefer silence, worried about reopening old wounds.